Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker, a story about pain, patience, and pliers. We're diving into the forgotten world of wartime dentistry. What happened when a soldier's worst enemy wasn't a sniper, but his own molar. Forget the gleaming white smiles you see in recruitment posters. The truth, by 1944, thousands of troops were fighting toothaches that felt like artillery fire. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Normandy, July 1944. The good news, you survived the landing. The bad news, your tooth didn't. You're a paratrooper of the 101st Airborne, somewhere near Carentan. The guns have quieted for now, but your jaw is pounding like someone's driving nails into it. Infection probably started weeks ago. It's hard to say toothbrushes aren't exactly standard issue on the front line. You try to chew on the good side, but even that sends pain shooting through your skull. So you line up outside the field aid station, where a small tent flaps lazily in the wind. Inside, the air smells of disinfectant, engine oil, and cigarette smoke. There's a folding table covered in metal tools that glint in the weak light forceps, dental probes, clamps, and a portable drill operated by foot pedal. The machine weighs about 35 pounds, which makes it one of the heaviest pieces of comfort ever dragged across Europe. You can hear the faint buzz of flies and the distant rumble of trucks. The dentist, a captain from the US Army Dental Corps, wipes his forehead with a rag and looks as tired as everyone else. Records show there was roughly one dentist per 1,000 troops, so appointments are brief. There's no laughing gas, no anesthesia, unless you count a shot of morphine, which might be better saved for the next wounded man coming in from the line. He sterilizes the pliers over a lighter. It's not exactly OSHA approved. Then he nods at you. Open up. The first US Army Dental Corps had been established back in 1911, but by 1942 it had exploded in size, nearly 10,000 officers trying to maintain oral health across millions of soldiers. Their official motto was service through prevention. Their unofficial one, pull it and move on. Every field kit came with forceps, scalpels, small mirrors, and little tins of tooth powder, a coarse mix of chalk and baking soda. It worked about as well as scrubbing your mouth with gravel. Toothpaste, the minty kind we know today, was considered a luxury. Soldiers brushed when they could using canteen water and a brush that usually smelled faintly of mildew. Imagine brushing your teeth on a camping trip, but there's artillery in the distance and you're rationing every sip of water. That was hygiene in the field. And honestly, many men didn't bother. The result? Rotting gums, abscesses, and toothaches that sent grown men begging for a dentist. In letters home, soldiers complained about what they called gum rot. One wrote, "My gums bleed every time I eat the hardtack, but it's the only thing we've got." Another admitted, "I'd trade a pack of Lucky Strikes for 5 minutes in a dentist's chair back home." There was even a kind of dark camaraderie about it. They joked that dental pain was the only thing the Germans couldn't improve upon. One infantryman wrote in his diary, "They said a good smile boosts morale." Most of us are smiling through missing molars. Outside the tent, engines idle. Trucks roll by hauling ammo and supplies, and every now and then, his soldier exits the makeshift dental chair holding a handkerchief to his mouth. A bloody tooth wrapped neatly inside. The sound of the drill is constant, a slow, whining rhythm powered by a foot pedal like a sewing. The dentist presses down with his boot to spin the drill, then releases to catch his breath. It's monotonous, almost hypnotic. The sound blends with the hum of flies and the rustle of canvas, a strange symphony of pain and routine. You can almost smell the antiseptic, sharp, chemical, and slightly sweet. A few feet away, someone lights a cigarette, the smoke mixing with the disinfectant in the humid air. It's the smell of survival in its own grim way. It's easy to forget how primitive field medicine was compared to what we have now. Today, even a basic dental clinic has suction hoses, bright lights, and sterilizers. Back then, a tent, a bucket of water, and a foot pump, if you were lucky, and yet these field dentists worked miracles. Records show that during 1944 alone, they performed millions of procedures, from extractions to temporary fillings, all while moving with the front lines. They were, in a way, the unsung medics of morale, because when a man couldn't eat, he couldn't fight. Think about that next time you complain about your dentist being late. At least yours doesn't have to pause mid-procedure because of incoming mortar fire. Some soldiers tried their own fixes before seeing the professionals, chewing on cloves, applying whiskey, or using rifle cleaning oil as makeshift disinfectant. None of it worked for long. The infection usually won. Dental emergencies became so common that field medics learned basic extraction techniques. A medic manual from 1943 casually mentions, when dental personnel are unavailable, field extraction may be performed using sterilized forceps. Translation: if it hurts bad enough and you've got pliers, you're now the dentist. Veterans later described the sensation as a crunch you feel in your soul. Others simply said it was better than the toothache. By nightfall, the aid station glows faintly from inside. The dentist keeps going, one man after another, a steady rhythm of pull, rinse, pack, repeat. Every now and then the generator sputters, the lights flicker, and he pauses to steady the drill with his foot. You can hear someone humming a tune softly, maybe to calm himself, maybe to drown out the sound. The tune doesn't help much. In those small pockets of downtime between battles, it wasn't bullets or bombs that broke morale. It was the small, persistent miseries, blisters, infections, hunger, and yes, teeth. The war on plaque was quiet, but relentless. Somewhere outside, artillery rumbles again, distant thunder on the horizon. The dentist doesn't even look up. He's used to it now. He grips the forceps, braces his boot against the stool, and keeps working. It's strange to think that in a war filled with tanks, planes, and explosions, one of the most common battlefield sounds was the creak of a pedal-powered drill. A little machine that fought an invisible enemy decay. If you've ever had a root canal, you know that dull, numbing dread of sitting in the chair, staring at the ceiling, pretending it's not happening. Now imagine doing that in a tent, in the middle of summer, surrounded by mud, diesel fumes, and the distant echo of gunfire. That's what these men endured, and somehow they still joked about it afterward. Dark humor was how they coped. "At least I'll lose weight," one man joked, after being told he couldn't eat solid food for 3 days. Another said, "If the Germans don't get me, the dentist will." By late evening, the queue outside has thinned. The dentist finally sits back, wipes his hands, and stretches his aching leg. He's been pressing that pedal for 10 hours straight. He doesn't smile, maybe can't, but he looks at the pile of extracted teeth in the tray, gives a slow nod, and lights a cigarette. Outside, the camp settles. Crickets chirp. Somewhere in the distance, a generator hums. The air is thick with humidity and the metallic scent of blood. As night falls over Normandy, the drill still whirs in the dark. One more molar gone, one less soldier moaning. But tomorrow there'll be a new problem, keeping those tools clean in a war zone crawling with mud. You know that feeling when you forget your toothbrush on a weekend trip and spend 2 days trying to scrape your teeth clean with your tongue? Now imagine that trip lasts 3 years. Your bathroom is a muddy trench, and the only thing resembling toothpaste is a tin of baking soda that's older than you are. Welcome to the daily dental dilemma of World War II, where oral hygiene was less about minty freshness and more about pure survival. So let's drift back to 1943, somewhere in Italy, the ground soaked with days of rain, the air thick with diesel and wet wool. Soldiers crouch in a makeshift camp beside a burned-out farmhouse. They've already cleaned their rifles. Next comes their teeth, at least in theory. The US Army Hygiene Manual for that year gave simple, if unhelpful, instructions. Rinse if you can, scrape if you must. Imagine getting that advice from your dentist. No mention of fluoride, no toothbrush emoji, just good luck. The military did its best to standardize hygiene, but the field didn't care much for regulations. Toothpaste was replaced by a gritty tooth powder. made from baking soda, chalk, and sometimes ground pumice, the same mineral used to polish metal parts. Brushing was a full contact sport. The powder came in small tins that leaked easily, so soldiers often found it mixed with tobacco or rations, a minty meal in the worst possible way. In theory, a field soldier's dental kit weighed about half a pound. In reality, it often got tossed to save weight for ammunition or a spare pair of socks. Hygiene, after all, didn't win firefights, but toothaches, those could end careers. Military records show that by 1944, dental issues were among the top 5 non-combat medical complaints in the European theatre. The average soldier, depending on where he served, lost 3 to 4 teeth during his deployment. Not to bullets, to bacteria. In North Africa, brushing came with its own set of problems. The water was often rationed or unsafe to drink. Sand found its way into everything: canteens, helmets, food, and yes, mouths. Some troops got creative. They'd mix sand with soap, creating a kind of desert toothpaste that was equal parts exfoliant and regret. One British officer reportedly described it as brushing one's teeth with the Sahara itself. The result: sparkling clean enamel, shredded gums. Conditions in the Pacific were even worse. Jungle humidity turned toothbrush bristles to mush. Troops fought not only enemy forces, but a host of fungal infections that thrived in the damp air. Gingivitis, trench mouth, abscesses all flourished in that tropical paradise of decay. Dentists improvised with antiseptic powders and iodine rinses, but resources ran thin. One Navy corpsman wrote in his diary from Guadalcanal, "We use whiskey before we pull." He didn't specify whether that was for the patient, the dentist, or both. Imagine trying to floss while someone's shelling your kitchen. That's about how dental care worked in the field. Extractions were done on folding chairs with morphine if it was available, and with whiskey or nothing if it wasn't. Anesthetic ether evaporated too quickly in heat. Equipment rusted within days, and the smell, a mix of disinfectant, blood, and damp canvas, became part of the war's sensory memory. Field extractions followed a grimly practical routine. Step 1, find a place to sit that won't collapse. Step 2, sterilize forceps over a lighter or campfire. Step 3, hope the soldier doesn't pass out before you finish. There was no reclining dental chair, no soothing elevator music unless you counted the distant thud of artillery. Sometimes a medic, not a dentist, had to do it. The Army's official ratio was 1 dentist for every 1,000 troops. That sounds decent until you remember those troops were often spread across miles of mud, jungle, or ocean. In practice, it meant you were lucky if you saw a dentist once per campaign. Otherwise, you prayed your molars behaved. One sergeant in the 36th Infantry wrote home, "Tell Doc Miller he can keep his fancy office."
Out here, the only drill sound is from the enemy. You can almost hear the forced humor through the pain, a kind of weary laughter that soldiers used to stay sane. Even Navy men weren't spared.
On ships, brushing was mandatory or at least encouraged, but fresh water wasn't guaranteed. Saltwater rinses were common, but they came with consequences. The salt corroded toothbrush bristles and irritated gums, which in turn led to bleeding, which in turn led to infections. It was a vicious, salty cycle. Sailors sometimes made paste from powdered soap and baking soda. It didn't foam, it didn't taste good, but it left a faint illusion of cleanliness, which in war was often all anyone could ask for. Meanwhile, the Red Cross launched campaigns to remind troops that brushing wasn't optional. Posters showed smiling soldiers with the slogan, "A clean mouth means a fighting man." A noble thought, but one look at a foxhole and you could tell morale mattered more than molars. One dental officer even joked that his job was to keep smiles wide enough for propaganda photos. The humor was dark, but it worked.
Soldiers laughed about it.
They had to. Dental officers, one veteran said years later, were the only ones who could make grown men volunteer for guard duty just to avoid them. By mid-1944, the military realized that tooth decay was more than a cosmetic issue. It was logistical.
Pain meant distraction.
Infection meant evacuation. Every man sidelined by an abscess was one less man carrying a rifle. The war on plaque had strategic value. In response, the Army Dental Corps developed mobile dental units, essentially dentists on wheels. These field trucks carried everything from foot-powered drills to portable chairs that folded like accordion beds. They could operate anywhere, from Normandy to New Guinea. The downside? The chairs weighed about 35 pounds and attracted every fly within 50 yards. One dentist recalled working in 100-degree heat with a towel over his face to keep insects out of his nose. Talk about occupational hazards. Modern comparison? Imagine doing your dental cleaning inside a sauna surrounded by mosquitoes, while someone occasionally fired mortars in the distance. You'd skip flossing too. Across all theatres, soldiers adapted in small, often disgusting ways. Some chewed tobacco to mask bad breath, others rubbed salt or baking soda directly onto their gums. A few carried charcoal tablets believing they'd purify the mouth. Spoiler, they didn't. But the placebo effect was real, and sometimes that's all that kept morale intact. By late 1944, dental decay rates had become a data goldmine. Military medical officers tracked every lost tooth, every extraction, every complaint. The data was later used, no exaggeration, to justify the introduction of fluoride toothpaste in the civilian market after the war. In a strange way, the suffering of soldiers in muddy trenches helped shape the toothpaste aisle you walk down today. History, as usual, hides in the ordinary. Of course, none of that comforted the men at the time. Letters from the front are filled with casual mentions of dental pain slipped between talk of rations and weather. "Tooth killing me again," one soldier scrawled in his journal near Anzio. "Doc says wait till next rotation.
I might not have any teeth left by then." Another wrote home that his front tooth fell out while biting into hardtack a cracker so dense it could double as armor plating. Still, they laughed.
They had to. One GI wrote, "At least I won't need a dentist when this war's over. They'll all be gone already." By the end of the war, the numbers were staggering. Over 15 million teeth pulled across all Allied forces. Countless more saved through grit, luck, and a lot of whiskey. Dental science advanced, yes, but morale? That was the real miracle. As 1945 drew near, dental units were still at work in the ruins of Europe and the steaming jungles of the Pacific. The war was ending. The drills kept turning. By 1945, dental units had pulled over 15 million teeth worldwide. But as the guns fell silent, one question lingered. What did all that pain teach the military about keeping men battle-ready and smiling? The guns went silent in 1945, but the drills didn't. While cities rebuilt, another kind of reconstruction began, quieter, cleaner, and somehow more personal. The war had ended, but for millions of soldiers, the battle for their mouths had only just begun. When the Army Dental Corps compiled its 1946 report, the numbers were staggering. Over 100 million dental procedures had been performed during the war, fillings, extractions, repairs, and emergency surgeries done everywhere from jungle tents to hospital ships. It was dentistry on an industrial scale, and it had changed the field forever. The same data that once catalogued misery now told a story of progress. Every aching jaw and cracked molar had been recorded, analyzed, and turned into a lesson. For the first time, medicine realized that teeth weren't just cosmetic, they were operational. You couldn't fire a rifle or blow a trumpet if your mouth was infected. A toothache could ground a pilot faster than a bullet. That understanding would ripple far beyond the battlefield. By 1946, military researchers began turning their wartime experience into civilian innovation. The same mobile dental trucks that once rolled through France were refitted into mobile X-ray units for peacetime clinics. Field sterilizers became prototypes for portable autoclaves. Even the rough and ready folding chairs inspired a new generation of lightweight dental equipment. Dentistry, long considered a sleepy cousin of surgery, had gone to war and come back a combat veteran, leaner, smarter, and obsessed with prevention. One of the biggest lessons came from an unlikely source: data. Army medical officers had tracked every cavity, every infection, every extraction across millions of soldiers. When scientists reviewed those records after the war, they found something remarkable. Troops from certain regions of the US had significantly fewer cavities. The common factor? naturally high fluoride levels in their hometown water supplies. That observation lit a fuse. Within a decade, fluoride would move from obscure chemistry to public policy. Grand Rapids, Michigan became the first U.S. city to fluoridate its water in 1945, but it was the military's dental crisis that gave scientists the momentum and the evidence to convince the world. The toothpaste revolution had begun. So, in a strange twist, the same conflict that destroyed cities also gave birth to brighter smiles. Call it the irony of progress. One generation's pain becoming the next generation's prevention. Meanwhile, back home, the Veterans Administration faced a challenge few anticipated: millions of returning servicemen with mouths in ruins. Cavities, gum disease, missing teeth, poorly healed extractions. For some, eating solid food was difficult. For others, it was a matter of dignity. The VA established one of the largest dental care programs in history. Clinics were built beside hospitals. Artificial teeth were fitted by the thousands. For many veterans, it was their first experience with a real dentist. One veteran later joked, "The first thing I did after discharge found a dentist who used Novocaine." Another said he didn't care about medals. He just wanted molars. Behind the humor was truth. The war had exposed how fragile health could be, how something as small as a tooth could affect morale, confidence, even identity. In a world eager to rebuild, smiles became symbols of recovery. The military kept learning too. Wartime improvisation inspired new research into field sanitation, diet, and the link between nutrition and dental disease. The same rations that kept men alive had also corroded their enamel. Sugar and refined flour were convenient but costly. Post-war nutrition programs quietly borrowed from those lessons, adding vitamins and reducing excess sugar long before low sugar became a marketing slogan. Even the humble toothbrush got an upgrade. Synthetic nylon bristles developed during the war to replace scarce animal hair became the new standard. It was cleaner, cheaper, and longer lasting, one more small victory born from necessity. By the early 1950s, dental offices across America looked subtly different. Fluoride toothpaste on the shelf.
Nylon brushes in every bath.
Portable X-rays humming softly. Each innovation traced back, in some way, to the fields and foxholes of the 1940s. But beyond technology, there was a shift in mindset, a recognition that prevention mattered more than repair. Wartime dentistry had been a relentless cycle of pain and extraction. Post-war dentistry aimed to end that cycle. Civilian dentists began adopting the military's record-keeping precision, tracking patients' oral health over time, emphasizing education and regular cleaning. A checkup today keeps the drill away. One early campaign read a far cry from "rinse if you can, scrape if you must." This cultural change spread quietly. Schools introduced dental hygiene lessons. Companies added toothbrushes to ration kits. By the late 1950s, brushing twice a day was not just recommended, it was normal. And it all started with a generation of soldiers who learned the hard way what neglect could cost. Some of them reflected on it years later with a mix of humor and disbelief. "I survived Normandy," one veteran said, "but the army dentist nearly finished the job." Another recalled trading chocolate for dental wax because chewing was a gamble. For many, the trauma of field dentistry became a kind of shared legend, a reminder of endurance. They could laugh about it only because they'd lived through it. One historian even quipped, "WW2 may not have fixed the world, but it did fix overbites." Behind the laughter was a deeper truth. Progress rarely comes from comfort. It comes from frustration, from pain, from the stubborn refusal to repeat mistakes. By the 1960s, those wartime lessons had quietly reshaped public health worldwide. Fluoridation spread to cities from Canada to New Zealand. Dental hygiene campaigns reached schools in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The toothbrush, once a personal luxury, became a symbol of modern civilization. And yet, for the men who'd been there, the memories remained tactile. The metallic taste of powdered soap, the sting of saltwater rinses, the relief of seeing a real dentist in a real chair under clean light. For them, every post-war cleaning carried an echo of the past, a small ritual of gratitude that it was finally over. The 1946 Dental Corps report closed with a simple line: "Experience in war has demonstrated that oral health is a matter of national efficiency." It sounded bureaucratic, but behind the wording was something almost poetic. They'd learned, painfully, that a single tooth could decide a battle, or at least a soldier's ability to fight one. That lesson filtered quietly into peacetime. When nations spoke of rebuilding, they meant more than bridges and factories. They meant bodies, minds, smiles, because when a soldier returned home, the first thing he wanted after food, after rest, was to feel human again, to sit in a clean chair, open his mouth, and trust that this time the pain would lead somewhere better. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize innovation, to say the war gave us progress, but the truth is softer, slower. It wasn't heroism that made modern dentistry, it was discomfort. Millions of tiny, forgettable aches that demanded answers. The quiet science of survival. The next time you brush your teeth without thinking, you're part of that legacy. Every squeeze of toothpaste, every fluoride rinse, every painless filling, it all began in muddy tents under flickering lanterns, with a medic doing his best and a soldier trying not to scream. Every empire falls, every soldier fades, but somewhere, in every toothpaste tube, there's a little piece of World War II's hard-earned wisdom. You know that feeling when your washing machine breaks,
and suddenly every t-shirt you own is a science experiment?
Now imagine that, but you're in southern Italy. It's 1943, the air smells like cordite and diesel, and your washing machine is a dented metal drum balanced over a campfire. That was laundry day at war. In September 1943, just after the Salerno landings, Allied forces were slogging their way through Italy's mud and mountains. The campaign was supposed to be short. It wasn't. Rain turned fields into soup, uniforms into stiff, mud-coated armor. And somehow, amid artillery and malaria, the army decided men should still have clean underwear. Enter the field laundry units, 20-man detachments, equipped with one steam sterilizer, 3 1 2-ton trucks, a tent, and an almost insulting optimism. Their mission: clean the clothes of thousands of soldiers who hadn't seen soap in weeks. Each unit processed around 3,000 pounds of clothing per day, if water and fuel cooperated, which they rarely did. One report from the 45th Infantry Division noted laundry work interrupted by enemy aircraft and shortage of lye. That's about as 1943 as it gets. Water was the biggest problem. Salerno's wells were unreliable, and frontline water trucks were usually reserved for drinking, not scrubbing. So laundrymen got creative. They collected rainwater, siphoned puddles, or when desperate borrowed from artillery cooling tanks. It gave clothes a faint metallic tang, but nobody complained. Soap, too, was a luxury. GI soap rations were tiny, designed more for shaving than sanitation. When supplies ran low, soldiers used crushed laundry tablets, wood ash, or even sand. Sand worked surprisingly well for scrubbing, especially for nurses who washed surgical linens by hand. One nurse from the 95th Evacuation Hospital wrote in her diary, "We washed sheets in helmets today. The sand scoured, the water boiled, and everything smelled faintly of cordite. But it was clean enough to matter." Clean clothes weren't just about hygiene, they were about sanity. When you're living in a foxhole, surrounded by damp gear and trench stench, a pair of clean socks can feel like civilization. Commanders knew it too. That's why laundry trucks were sometimes escorted by MPs, not because they were valuable tactically, but because they were priceless psychologically. One officer joked, "Clean clothes didn't win battles, but they sure made losing more comfortable." And he wasn't wrong. The field laundry process was an oddly industrial ballet. First, the dirty uniforms were sorted by unit and tag. Then, they were boiled in 200-gallon drums with soap powder, run through ringers, often hand-cranked, and hung on ropes strung between olive trees or tank treads. Each cycle took hours more if the Luftwaffe dropped by. Imagine trying to fold your laundry while an air raid siren blares and someone yells for cover. Soldiers sometimes ran for foxholes mid-rinse, returning later to find their socks half-boiled, half-burnt. Still better than before, one private wrote in a letter home. The laundry tents were easy to find. You just followed the smell of wet wool, diesel smoke, and whatever passed for detergent that week. Temperatures inside could reach 110 degrees. The men sweated constantly, their own clothes filthy long before anyone else's got clean, the steam sterilizer. Officially, the M1937 laundry unit field steam could process about 100 garments an hour. It used gasoline burners to boil water, sending up clouds of vapor that look suspiciously like smoke, not ideal when you're trying to stay hidden from German spotters. When the machines broke, which was often improvisation took over, helmets became wash basins, tent poles became drying racks, and truck tarps became makeshift ironing boards. Soldiers even pressed uniforms under vehicle tires, field dry cleaning, one called it. The irony was thick. Soldiers who hadn't bathed in days were scrubbing their uniforms like they were entering a fashion show. But that's the thing about war. Cleanliness became a tiny rebellion against chaos. A private might not control the weather, or the artillery, or the next attack, but he could control whether his shirt had buttons, and that mattered. Psychologists later noted that soldiers who maintained grooming rituals, shaving, washing, or even brushing boots showed higher morale and lower rates of combat stress. So yes, those men boiling socks weren't just killing lice. They were keeping their sanity intact. Sometimes, though, the effort bordered on absurd. During one particularly wet week near Naples, a British laundry detachment spent 3 days washing uniforms only for a passing convoy to splash mud all over their drying lines. The men watched silently for a moment, then burst out laughing, the dark, weary laughter of people who'd seen worse. One corporal wrote home, "At least the mud's ours now." Local. That gallows humor kept them going. Even naval crews had their struggles. On destroyers and submarines, laundry was done in salt water with soap made from leftover cooking grease. Clothes came out stiff and smelling faintly of bacon. Sailors joked that if they fell overboard, at least they'd float. In the Pacific, humidity turned everything into mildew within hours. Soldiers hung clothes near cook fires or engine exhaust just to dry them faster. The smell of clean was subjective, somewhere between diesel, smoke, and despair. A Marine sergeant on Bougainville summed it up best. If it doesn't move and it's not loaded, wash it. If it's moving, it's probably the enemy. By late 1943, field laundry discipline was codified in Army manuals. Boil water for 5 minutes before washing. Rotate uniforms to reduce bacterial growth. Keep socks dry to prevent trench foot. Simple, obvious rules, but in a war of attrition, these were the difference between a fighting man and a feverish one. Laundry became logistics. Hygiene became strategy. And the humble act of washing became a form of resistance against disease, filth, and despair. As dusk fell over the Salerno hills, the last load of uniforms hung heavy on makeshift lines. The air cooled and steam drifted from the kettles. Somewhere, artillery echoed in the distance, a reminder that laundry day, like everything else in war, could end abruptly. But for now, the socks were dry. The shirts smelled faintly of ash instead of fear, and for one quiet evening, that was enough. Tomorrow they'd face mortars again, but at least their socks were dry. For now, you know those moments when your deodorant quits halfway through the day, and suddenly you become aware of everything? Now multiply that by a few weeks, add jungle heat, wool uniforms, and 10,000 nervous bodies. Welcome to the olfactory side of World War II. By late 1943, military engineers realized the enemy wasn't just German or Japanese, it was odor, the kind that came from too many men, too little water, and uniforms that could probably walk to the front line on their own. So the army turned to science, or more accurately, to chemistry. Field hygiene labs, small, mobile units attached to engineer battalions, began testing new soap formulas and disinfectants. The classic GI issue, laundry soap, powdered, type 2, was made mostly of sodium carbonate, tallow, and pine oil. It smelled faintly like motor grease and hope. When mixed with hard water, it produced foam thick enough to lubricate a truck, which, incidentally, soldiers sometimes did. But soap alone couldn't fight what was spreading through the ranks. Lice, fungus, and mildew, the unholy trinity of discomfort. Enter the DDT revolution. In 1943, Allied scientists introduced dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, a tongue twister that promised a nearly magical solution. Sprayed on uniforms, bedrolls, or directly onto skin, it killed lice on contact and kept them away for weeks. The US Army quickly made DDT powder as common as salt. Spray units operated at field laundries, delousing tens of thousands of garments per day. Each man's kit was dusted with DDT before being returned, a snowy film that soldiers joked made them look like walking donuts. It worked. Louse-borne diseases like typhus plummeted. Of course, no one then realized what DDT would do to the environment later, but in 1944 it was nothing short of miraculous. Odor control became its own science. Engineers experimented with charcoal filters in tents, rotating clothing sets to reduce bacterial growth, and water recycling systems that condensed steam back into usable rinse water. One British manual proudly noted that a single gallon could wash 3 shirts, if efficiently reused. Efficiently was doing a lot of work in that sentence. In practice, recycling water meant filtering it through sandbags and letting it settle. The resulting greyish liquid was poured back into the boiler, along with a generous splash of disinfectant, usually phenol or cresol, which smelled like a combination of hospital and anxiety. Soldiers said it was like washing in coffee that had already been drunk twice. In the Pacific, the problem multiplied by humidity. Nothing ever fully dried. Clothes rotted, boots molded, and men joked that fungus grew faster than their beards. So they improvised. One Marine recalled boiling socks over a gasoline stove, the fumes thick enough to make him lightheaded. The socks lived, he wrote, but I nearly didn't. Others used spare rifle oil as deodorant, a trick that mostly replaced one's smell with. Another, a sergeant on New Guinea, claimed the smell of DDT and diesel together kept even mosquitoes patriotic enough to
leave. Smell became identity.
Each unit had its signature aroma, part fuel, part sweat, part despair. You could tell who was nearby long before you saw them. The Army Quartermaster Corps even studied the psychology of odor. Reports noted that bad smells hurt morale as much as hunger or fatigue. Troops who managed to keep clean fought longer, focused better, complained less. So the science wasn't just about hygiene, it was about performance. One wartime memo read, "A man who smells too much like himself is a man distracted." That could almost be poetry, if it weren't written in triplicate. Meanwhile, laundry engineers developed portable disinfectant sprayers, metal tanks strapped to jeeps, used to fog entire camps after outbreaks of fungus or lice. The fog lingered, creating a surreal mist that smelled like medicinal citrus and regret. Even prisoners of war and civilian camps received delousing stations. At the height of the war, the Allies deloused over 100 million uniforms per month, an astonishing logistical feat considering the fuel shortages and constant movement of troops. And yet, despite the science and steam, the smell never fully went away. It became a background note of the era, part fear, part human persistence. The British 8th Army in North Africa had its own take on odour management. Engineers issued eucalyptus oil for cleaning and boric acid foot powder to keep fungal infections down. Soldiers soon discovered that mixing the two produced a scent faintly reminiscent of burnt toothpaste. Some swore it worked better than camouflage. The enemy can't shoot what they can't stand to smell, one joked. Dark humour thrived wherever soap didn't. By 1944, deodorant experiments were underway, primitive aluminum chloride compounds packed in glass ampules. But in the field, practicality beat chemistry. Most soldiers relied on open air and hope. Navy crews hung shirts on signal lines between operations, the wind doing what detergent couldn't. Submariners burned alcohol-soaked rags to freshen the air, which naturally just smelled like burning socks. Even generals couldn't escape it. Dwight D. Eisenhower once quipped that a front line could be located by sound, then by smell. He wasn't exaggerating. Battlefields had their own olfactory signature cordite, sweat, mud, and whatever passed for lunch. The scent clung to everything: uniforms, tents, letters home. One war correspondent wrote, "You can't bomb away the smell." And in a strange, practical way, soldiers began to use odor as camouflage. Recon units learned that the enemy's sense of smell was often dulled by their own camps, so American and British troops stopped using strong disinfectants before night patrols. They wanted to smell like the jungle, not soap. The irony was rich. The science of smelling less became a tactical advantage. By the end of the war, entire manuals existed on field sanitation and odor control. Engineers had learned how to boil, bleach, and deodorize everything from tents to trucks. The victory wasn't glamorous, but it was measurable: fewer lice, fewer infections, higher morale. In the long view, it was one more reminder that modern war wasn't won by glory, but by logistics, by chemistry, steam, and men willing to wash socks over gasoline burners. Even generals couldn't escape the scent of war. It clung to everything. By 1945, the war machine had learned something unexpected. It wasn't just fuel, ammunition, or food that kept an army moving. It was water, soap, and the will to stay clean. What started as improvised bucket lines and boiling drums became one of the most efficient logistical systems in history. In a war remembered for tanks and bombers, it was the humble field washer that quietly proved a point. Morale depended on hygiene. Early in the war, laundry was chaos. In North Africa, men washed their uniforms in petrol tins and prayed they wouldn't catch fire. In Italy, nurses scrubbed sheets in mud-thick water under shell fire. And in the Pacific, socks disintegrated faster than they could be rinsed. But by 1944, the military had evolved. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, together with engineers and chemists, began introducing mobile purification units, trailers fitted with filters, heaters, and pumps. They could take swamp water, salt water, even bomb crater puddles, and turn them into something fit for washing and sometimes drinking. Each purification truck could clean 3,000 gallons a day. It didn't sound like much, but in the heat of Saipan or Burma, that was enough to keep an entire division from descending into chaos and infection. A war once fought with tanks and rifles was now also fought with chlorine tablets, sediment filters, and steam hoses. The military's obsession with cleanliness wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Field research during 1943-45 revealed something few had formally studied before: a direct correlation between hygiene and morale. Psychologists attached to medical units began documenting it. Soldiers who had access to clean water, fresh socks, and laundered uniforms displayed higher focus, fewer disciplinary problems, and better recovery from fatigue. One internal report stated simply, "A clean man fights longer." That line became doctrine. By mid-1944, laundry and sanitation were listed as Class 1 essentials, right alongside food and ammunition. The quartermaster's unofficial motto became "Feed them, clothe them, clean them" on the front lines. The changes were visible. The once clunky laundry trucks were now streamlined, each equipped with collapsible water tanks, oil-fired boilers, and rotating drum washers capable of handling 300 pounds of fabric per cycle. Soldiers could drop off a bag of clothes in the morning and pick them up by evening pressed, dried and marked with stencils for identification. It was civilization in miniature, a reminder, amid rubble and rain, that order still existed somewhere. Nurses wrote home describing how fresh sheets changed the atmosphere of entire field hospitals. "A patient in a clean bed believes he might survive," one wrote. As the war ended, the lessons didn't. The same engineers who designed laundry trailers went on to build the first mobile decontamination units, then modular field kitchens, and later the mobile hospitals used in Korea and Vietnam. The basic principle was the same: self-contained, portable, and built to restore normalcy wherever chaos reigned. Laundry wasn't glamorous, but it became the template for modern military logistics: flexibility, sanitation, and human comfort as part of combat readiness. Even peacetime benefited. When floods hit the Midwest in 1947, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers rolled out those same purification and sanitation trailers. They washed blankets, sterilized clothing, and purified drinking water for civilians long before the Red Cross had permanent systems in place. In Japan, during the post-war reconstruction, Allied forces used repurposed laundry units to clean and disinfect clothing in refugee camps. A small detail, but an enormous gesture, it helped prevent outbreaks of typhus and cholera. Every clean shirt was a tiny act of stability in a world rebuilding itself. The science of sanitation advanced too. Wartime data led to the creation of chlorinated detergents, improved soap-free cleansers, and the first generation of synthetic surfactants. What soldiers had learned about removing grease, mud and blood from canvas and wool became the foundation of industrial cleaning chemistry. In the 1950s, laundry had become chemistry, and chemistry became civilization. Behind all this progress were people whose names rarely appeared in textbooks: the field washers, the men who lived ankle-deep in grey water and soap scum, feeding garments into drums for 16 hours a day. They weren't remembered in parades, but they were remembered by every soldier who got a warm towel, a dry pair of socks, or a shirt that didn't smell like defeat. One technician in France wrote in his logbook, "The best sound in the world is a clean shirt flapping in the wind." It means we're still here. That, more than medals or machines, summed up the quiet dignity of the job. By the 1950s, laundry logistics had evolved into a full-blown discipline. The Army Quartermaster School at Fort Lee began teaching courses on sanitation and morale maintenance. NATO later adopted similar programs, integrating laundry units into every field. Operation plan right next to medical and fuel supply, but modern. Armies now deploy containerized laundry systems that can wash 600 uniforms per hour using automated water recycling. The descendant of that creaky 1943 boiler truck now runs on solar panels and microfiltration, a testament to how something as simple as soap became a cornerstone of survival. And perhaps the most poetic legacy came not from technology, but from understanding. The war taught militaries that cleanliness wasn't luxury, it was psychology. It meant discipline, structure, and hope. A soldier in clean clothes felt human again, even in the dirt of Anzio or the jungles of Guadalcanal. It wasn't about smelling better, it was about feeling alive. In disaster zones today, from hurricanes to refugee camps, those same principles guide response teams. When portable water systems and hygiene tents roll in, they owe their design to the same field washers who once battled lice and mud under shell fire. It's a lineage few recognize, but one the world still relies on, because the truth is, hygiene has always been about more than health. It's about identity. Clean clothes meant order. Order meant civilization. And civilization, in the middle of war, was victory in miniature. Turns out clean clothes were a quiet weapon, one that kept armies human. By the final winter of World War II, something quietly revolutionary had taken root behind the front lines. Not a new weapon, not a secret code, but a system of hoses, boilers, and barrels that changed how armies thought about survival. It began with laundry, and it ended with logistics. In the mud of Italy or the humidity of Burma, soldiers had long joked that the cleanest thing in camp was the cook's ladle, and even that was debatable. But by 1944, a quiet transformation was underway. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, weary of watching entire companies go down with skin infections and trench rash, began field testing mobile purification units, portable water cleaning systems mounted on the back of trucks. They looked like something out of a plumber's nightmare. Pipes snaking into drums, filters clanging in rhythm, gauges trembling with each hiss of steam. But they worked. Each unit could turn brown swamp water into something almost clear, clean enough to wash a uniform, and on good days, drink. One purification truck could process 3,000 gallons a day. It wasn't glamorous, but in the jungle, that was as precious as ammunition. From there, the system expanded, folding boilers, rotating drums, chemical disinfectants, and new detergents designed to break down oils and mud. The Army had, without quite meaning to, invented mobile sanitation engineering. The effects rippled far beyond clean shirts. Psychologists attached to field hospitals began noticing a strange, measurable pattern. Soldiers who had access to regular laundry and bathing were not only healthier, they were happier. Reports from 1944 onward drew a direct line between hygiene and morale. Men who slept on clean sheets complained less. Units with steady water access reported fewer disciplinary cases. It wasn't just about germs, it was about dignity. One report summarized it perfectly. A clean man fights longer. That phrase became unofficial doctrine. The logic was simple. If you could keep men feeling human, they'd keep acting like it even in hell. So by late 1944, field hygiene was classified as essential supply. Laundry trucks were scheduled like artillery, part of the rhythm of war. Behind those machines were people, the field washers, 20-man teams who worked 18-hour shifts beside roaring boilers. They lived ankle-deep in grey water, scrubbed and steamed and folded, and often moved only when the front line did. Few remembered their names, but everyone remembered their work. As one corporal in France wrote, "Nothing boosts morale like a pair of socks that doesn't crunch when you walk." In a world collapsing into mud, those socks were civilization after the war. The lessons of these soap-covered soldiers were quietly absorbed into peacetime. Innovation. Engineers who had once purified water for laundry camps went on to design the first mobile decontamination and medical units. The same blueprints inspired MASH hospitals in Korea and the modular field bases of Vietnam. The logic stayed constant. Build systems that can move anywhere, clean anything, and keep humans functioning. Laundry, it turned out,
had been the perfect prototype, and when peace returned,
those lessons proved just as vital. In 1947,
massive floods swept across the American Midwest.
entire towns lost access to clean water. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers deployed the same laundry and purification trucks from Europe, now repainted and renamed emergency sanitation units. They washed blankets for families, purified river water, and sterilized clothes for hospitals. What began as a wartime necessity became the backbone of modern disaster response. The Red Cross took note. So did the newly formed United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. By the early 1950s, humanitarian agencies were building their own versions compact, truck-mounted purification systems, modeled almost exactly on the Army's 1944 designs. The connection between clean clothes and human survival had finally become official. At the same time, chemistry advanced. The desperate innovations of the war-powdered detergents, chlorine disinfectants, and grease solvents evolved into the first generation of synthetic surfactants. Soap factories that once supplied the military pivoted to civilian production. And just like that, the humble field laundry indirectly helped create the modern detergent industry. By 1955, washing machines were appearing in American homes that used technologies first designed for trenches and troop ships. Civilization was now quite literally cleaner because of war. Even the psychology endured. When post-war armies studied why some units held out longer than others, hygiene kept reappearing as an invisible factor. Fresh uniforms boosted confidence. The smell of clean fabric, however faint, reminded men of home. It wasn't nostalgia. It was stability. A commander once said,
"You can tell the state of an army by its laundry." He wasn't wrong. Today's militaries still
carry that legacy. Modern field logistics include containerized laundry systems that can wash and dry 600 uniforms per hour using recycled water. Solar-powered purification units can turn seawater into drinking water or a full rinse cycle in minutes. The technology has grown sophisticated, but the principle remains ancient. You can't fight well if you feel filthy. That's why every modern humanitarian operation, from earthquake zones to refugee camps, still deploys mobile water systems first. The cleanup comes before the rebuild. The blueprint for that? A 1943 laundry truck outside Salerno. There's something poetic about it, the way survival and civilization always meet at the edge of a wash basin. In the ruins of Europe, soldiers learned that clean clothes were more than comfort. They were a quiet declaration that the world could be rebuilt. From those field washers came lessons in logistics, psychology, and even empathy, the understanding that to preserve humanity in chaos, Sometimes all you need is water that runs clear. Turns out clean clothes were a quiet weapon, one that kept armies human. Picture this. You've caught the worst cold of your life. Your nose won't stop running, your throat feels like sandpaper, and your body can't decide whether to freeze or sweat. Now imagine you're trying to sleep through it inside an unheated barrack somewhere on the English coast while the Luftwaffe drops bombs outside. That was winter, 1940, and for the British Army, the most relentless enemy that season wasn't German, it was viral. By December, temperatures across southern England hovered just above freezing. The rain didn't fall so much as hover in the air, a grey, endless drizzle that soaked uniforms, blankets, and tempers alike. Soldiers stationed from Dover to Portsmouth learned the hard truth of military medicine. No matter how brave you were, you couldn't outmarch a head cold. Field hospitals were already overflowing with shrapnel cases. The men with coughs and fevers got what space was left, usually the dampest corner, and a pot of lukewarm tea. A 1941 medical report quietly noted, upper respiratory infection has rendered more men unfit than enemy action. It wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating. For every soldier injured in a raid, 2 or 3 were sidelined with sinus infections, bronchitis, or what everyone simply called the barracks flu. British barracks of the time were architectural masterpieces in their ability to trap moisture. Wooden huts leaked from above and condensed from within. You could practically wring water from the walls. Men slept in wool blankets that never truly dried each breath, turning to frost against the window panes. The standard issue heater was a small coal stove that barely warmed the man sitting on top of it. At night, when the air raid sirens started, the heat went out and hundreds of shivering troops shuffled into trenches, coughing in unison like an orchestra of misery. One private recalled, "You'd be crouched in a shelter, teeth chattering, someone sneezing down the line, and you'd pray it was just the cold, not the start of pneumonia." Medical officers did what they could. The problem was scale. Britain's doctors were stretched thin between civilian bomb shelters, refugee centres, and the front lines. So the army improvised aspirin, salt gargles, menthol ointment, and the eternal cure-all hot tea. Tea was everywhere. It was brewed from powdered rations in enamel mugs, poured through socks when filters ran out, and shared from thermoses that had seen better days.
Men swore it helped. It didn't cure anything.
But it gave them something warm to hold, and that mattered. One medic wrote in his diary, "The line between medicine and morale is thinner than paper." The real challenge wasn't just the cold, it was silence. During blackout restrictions, soldiers were ordered to maintain strict noise discipline. No lights, no loud conversations, and ideally, no sneezing. That last one proved problematic. There were countless stories of jumpy sentries firing warning shots at rustling noises in the dark, only to discover the culprit was a private trying to stifle a sneeze. Hence the dark joke that circulated around camp. Catch a cold, catch a bullet. Nobody ever laughed loudly, they just sniffled and nodded. The flu epidemic that winter hit both soldiers and civilians. In London, bomb shelters became perfect incubators, crowded, humid, and full of nervous coughing. Doctors reported cases spreading faster underground than above it, and yet people still came, because the only thing worse than coughing in a shelter was coughing under an air raid. It was a strange balance. Survival from bombs came at the cost of illness from breathing recycled air. One warden joked, "If Jerry doesn't get you, your bunkmate's germs will." The War Office issued pamphlets urging proper ventilation, which was charming advice during nightly bombings. The average Brit solved it by cracking a window for exactly 10 minutes a day and then regretting it instantly. Back on the front lines, medics learned to ration tissues the way infantry rationed bullets. The supply chain simply couldn't keep up. Some units used toilet paper, others handkerchiefs recycled beyond recognition, and sometimes the sleeve was the only option, a universal, if unsanitary, solution. By early 1941, medical staff were experimenting with saltwater sprays and makeshift nasal rinses. They weren't pleasant. Imagine gargling seawater through your nose, but they worked surprisingly well. There was even a rumor that chewing tobacco helped sterilize the throat. It didn't. but it gave soldiers something to believe in and a good reason to spit at the enemy. What made the whole ordeal worse was monotony. Unlike battle, which at least came and went, the cold was relentless. It crept into boots, rations, even the ink on letters home. Mail was damp before it reached camp.
Socks froze overnight.
The sound of coughing blended with the hum of bombers overhead, a nightly duet of discomfort. Commanders learned quickly. Morale didn't just depend on victory, it depended on dry socks, hot tea, and the ability to breathe through one nostril. The psychological impact ran deep. Medical researchers later compared wartime colds to a kind of low-grade stress disorder, a constant physical reminder that you were stuck, tired, and mortal. Coughing became a soundtrack to endurance. It was proof that you were still there. One corporal wrote in his diary, "When you stopped coughing, someone asked if you were dead." Dark humor, perhaps, but that's how people survived. And yet, amid all this, there was something quietly remarkable. Despite illness, exhaustion, and the bitter chill, the British Army kept functioning. Trucks rolled, patrols continued, and the tea kettles miraculously never stopped whistling. Doctors might have called it respiratory resilience. Everyone else called it stubbornness. By the time spring finally arrived in 1941, the worst of the cold had passed, but the toll lingered. Thousands of soldiers had been hospitalized not for wounds, but for fevers, pneumonia, and flu-related fatigue. Still, compared to the horror of battle, a cold was almost comforting, familiar, ordinary, and that small sense of normality kept men sane. By spring, morale was hanging by a handkerchief. If you caught a cold in wartime Britain, your treatment options depended entirely on who you asked. A medical officer would prescribe aspirin, a nurse might hand you a salt gargle, and the corporal next to you would insist a shot of rum could cure anything short of amputation. In 1941, this was considered comprehensive healthcare. The irony was that Britain, at that very moment, was on the edge of a medical revolution. Penicillin was being quietly perfected in a laboratory in Oxford. While soldiers coughed their lungs out in drafty barracks, a handful of scientists were scraping mold from petri dishes, trying to grow enough of it to treat a single patient. Professor Howard Florey, biochemist Ernst Chain, and a small team of researchers at Oxford's Duns School were experimenting with this strange fungus, first noticed by Alexander Fleming back in 1928. Fleming had discovered it. Yes, but it was Florey and Chain who figured out how to use it. The trouble was scale. Each batch of mold juice was precious, measured in teaspoons, not bottles. They even recycled it from patients' urine to conserve supply. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. So while penicillin might have been the miracle cure, most soldiers in 1941 never saw it. Their medicine cabinet still looked like something from the 19th century. Iodine, bandages, menthol rub, and faith. Doctors did what they could. A typical British field hospital that winter had maybe a few ampules of sulfur drugs, some morphine for emergencies, and the eternal cure-all tea and toast. The rest was up to morale and wool. Wool socks were prized like gold. They didn't stop illness, but they made men believe they would. The army even distributed pamphlets encouraging troops to keep their feet warm to ward off fever. It wasn't medically sound, but it gave soldiers something to control a small victory against the invisible. As one private wrote, "If you can't beat Hitler, at least beat the sniffles." And then there was whiskey, or rum, or gin, or whatever liquid courage the quartermaster could spare. It was officially banned as medicine, but unofficially recommended everywhere. In one regiment's records, the anti-cold ration was listed simply as 50 milliliters, internal use, morale purposes, translated, a stiff drink before bed. Doctors joked that whiskey was the only anesthetic you can issue by the pint. It didn't cure much, but it dulled the symptoms, and that counted for something. There were soldiers who swore by raw onions, Vicks rubbed on socks, and even sleeping with a scarf over their nose to keep the lungs warm. Superstition became survival. In the absence of antibiotics, you took what you could, even if it was just placebo and prayer. Meanwhile, in those Oxford labs, Florey and Chain were racing time. They knew penicillin worked, it had already saved a few test patients, but producing enough for the entire military seemed impossible. So they did something quietly heroic. They approached American pharmaceutical companies for help. By 1943, their partnership with the US had scaled penicillin production to industrial levels. But in 1941-42, the soldiers in Britain still had no such luxury. They fought colds the old-fashioned way: grit, blankets and whiskey. It wasn't just about comfort. Illness genuinely threatened operations. Medical reports from early 1942 show that respiratory infections caused more lost manpower days than enemy action during certain winter months. At one point, the British Expeditionary Force in Iceland had over a quarter of its men unfit for duty due to flu-like symptoms. Even the RAF suffered. Cold, damp airfields led to endless cases of sinusitis and ear infections. The statistics were staggering. In the European theatre alone between 1940 and 1944, respiratory illnesses accounted for over 12 million lost duty days, the invisible battle no one wrote songs about. Still, soldiers adapted. They invented rituals, drinking tea with rum for the throat, sleeping with damp towels over radiators, or holding socks over smoky stoves to sterilize them. It didn't work, but it gave structure to the chaos. The humour kept them going too. One barracks in Yorkshire pinned a sign above the stove that read, "This heater cures pneumonia, influenza, and bad manners, results not guaranteed." Another unit nicknamed their infirmary Club Mucus. Admission was free, exit uncertain. Dark humour thrived where medicine lagged behind. By late 1942, things began to shift. Penicillin had moved from laboratory curiosity to wartime priority. The British and Americans launched a joint initiative to mass produce it using deep tank fermentation, a method discovered by a team of American scientists at Peoria, Illinois. Within 2 years, production skyrocketed from a few grams to millions of doses. But that came too late for the men who had already sneezed, coughed, and shivered through the worst winters of the Blitz. For them, the real miracle wasn't penicillin, it was perseverance. The ability to keep standing, keep working, and keep laughing through blocked noses and endless rain. Even after penicillin arrived in quantity, it didn't solve everything. It was reserved for the wounded, the infected, the dying. Colds were still non-essential complaints. So the whiskey rations continued. So did the wool socks. Some soldiers even preferred it that way. Medicine, they joked, had no sense of humour. At least rum did. By the end of 1944, Britain had distributed over 2.3 million doses of penicillin, a triumph of science born from muddy necessity. But the old remedies never really left. Even decades later, veterans swore by their wartime cures. One former corporal recalled, "They gave us penicillin, sure, but I still trust whiskey more. It never runs out." The war had taught the military an unexpected lesson. Morale and medicine weren't separate fronts, they were the same battle. A warm drink and a dry blanket could be as strategic as a new weapon. The science was catching up, yes, but the human instinct to self-medicate with humour, heat, and hope had always been ahead of its time. Science was catching up, just not fast enough for the next winter. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, another kind of war was just beginning, a war fought not in trenches or skies, but in petri dishes and laboratories. By then, the Allies had produced over 600 billion units of penicillin, enough to treat every infected wound on every front. It was a medical miracle that had arrived just in time to save millions, and it had been born from the chaos of necessity. But the real revolution wasn't in the numbers. It was in the idea that science could be mobilized, industrialized, and scaled as fast as bullets and bombs. For the first time, medicine had become a weapon of strategy. During the war, disease had quietly stalked every army. Colds, dysentery, malaria, trench foot, none of them headline-grabbing, but all of them deadly in their own slow, grinding way. Commanders learned quickly that it wasn't enough to win battles. You had to win against bacteria. The lessons stuck. By 1946, the US Army Medical Department and Britain's Royal Army Corps had compiled thousands of pages of hygiene data, everything from how often soldiers washed hands to how fast infection spread through a single tent. Those reports would go on to shape civilian health policies for decades. Military doctors realized something profound. A clean soldier fights longer, heals faster, and stays sane. From those wartime insights came an avalanche of peacetime progress. The U.S. Veterans Administration began offering comprehensive dental and medical programs, the first large-scale government health plan of its kind. Hospitals built new infection control units. Pharmaceutical companies that once made munitions now pivoted to antibiotics. And all across Britain and America, returning scientists fresh from military labs began to rebuild medicine with lessons learned from the sick bays of war. They had seen firsthand how germs could disable armies. Now they were determined to stop them from disabling societies. The 1940s gave birth to modern immunology, though few at the time called it that. Doctors who'd spent the war studying dysentery, malaria, and pneumonia began to see patterns. The body's defense wasn't random. It was systematic, trainable, even programmable. In 1947, the British Medical Journal published a quiet but remarkable statement. If the war has taught us anything, it is that the prevention of disease must be treated with the same seriousness as the treatment of wounds. That single sentence became the foundation of what we now call preventive medicine. Meanwhile, the antibiotic race exploded. Penicillin was just the beginning. Within 5 years, scientists had isolated streptomycin, chloramphenicol, tetracycline, each one discovered, refined, and distributed through networks originally built for war. Factories that had once produced TNT were now churning out capsules and vials. Military logistics, the art of moving supplies, fast and efficiently was repurposed for global vaccination campaigns and medical aid missions. It turned out the systems designed to win wars could also save lives. But perhaps the most unexpected outcome was philosophical. Before WW2, illness was often seen as personal misfortune, something endured privately. After the war, health became a shared responsibility. Nations that had coordinated armies now coordinated hospitals. Public hygiene programs, mass vaccination, and medical education all expanded under the same principle. If one soldier's cough could spread through a platoon, one citizen's illness could ripple through a country. The war had shown just how fragile and how interconnected human health really was. Even small wartime habits left lasting marks. Troops had learned to wash hands before meals, sterilize water, and isolate the sick. Simple protocols that later became the backbone of modern infection control. Military engineers who once purified swamp water in the Pacific designed the first mobile water treatment systems for civilian disaster relief. In hospitals, the phrase field sterilization evolved into autoclaving standards still used today, and those little glass penicillin vials once stored in wooden crates and shipped under fire inspired the design of temperature-controlled medical containers now used to transport vaccines worldwide. The war had turned improvisation into innovation. Of course, not every lesson was glamorous. Many of the discoveries came from tragedy, from what went wrong. Thousands of soldiers had fallen ill because rations spoiled, sanitation failed, or infections spread unchecked. Each mistake became data. Each loss became a line in the manual of modern medicine. Out of suffering came systems protocols so ordinary now that we rarely think of their origin. Sterilized instruments, single-use syringes, even the humble first aid kit, all of them born from the battlefield. In one post-war interview, a British medical officer reflected, "We learned that victory isn't always won by bullets, sometimes by tissues." He wasn't being poetic. He meant it literally. A soldier who could breathe through a clear nose and sleep through the night was simply more likely to survive, think straight, and obey orders. Cleanliness and medicine had become forms of discipline, invisible but vital. By the 1950s, that invisible war had gone global. The same scientists who had weaponized penicillin now led the World Health Organization's early disease eradication programs. They studied malaria in Burma, tuberculosis in Poland, smallpox in India, fighting the same microscopic enemies, but this time for peace. The front lines had shifted from foxholes to clinics. The uniforms had changed from khaki to white, but the mission was the same: survival. It's easy, looking back, to see penicillin as inevitable, as if it was bound to happen. But it wasn't. It was the product of sleepless nights, dirty equipment, and desperate hope. A cure born from mold and chaos. Every modern antibiotic, every vaccination program, every sterile hospital owes something to that frantic wartime effort, to the scientists who refused to accept that disease was just part of life. They turned the sick bay into a laboratory, and the laboratory into a legacy. And that's how the sniffles shaped modern medicine. Belgium, December 1944. The snow wasn't soft, it was iron hard, frozen mud laced with oil and shrapnel. In the middle of it, a tank sat motionless, its turret tilted like a tired head, its crew long gone to dig trenches nearby, and beside it, 3 men, sleeves rolled, breath visible in the night, hands black with grease. They weren't gunners or officers. They were mechanics, the unsung surgeons of steel. If the infantry carried rifles and the pilots carried wings, these men carried wrenches. Their patients didn't bleed, but they still screamed in grinding gears, broken pistons, and sputtering engines. The unit was officially called a forward maintenance section. Unofficially, they were the miracle workers of the Ardennes. Each night, after the shooting slowed, they crawled under Shermans with flashlights between their teeth, patching up whatever the battlefield had broken that day. Their motto was simple: if it moves, grease it. If it doesn't, hit it. Half joke, half scripture. The tank they worked on tonight was an M4A3 Sherman, a 30-ton compromise between mobility and mayhem. Its Ford V8 engine could roar like a lion until mud clogged its lungs, which was often. In peacetime, fixing such a beast required a proper garage, a crew of specialists, and hydraulic lifts. In wartime Belgium, all they had were one canvas tent, a crate of tools, and faith. Rainwater filled every socket. Mud froze inside the treads. The repair tent sagged under the weight of snow and exhaustion. Every bolt they turned carried the weight of tomorrow's battle. They called themselves the Grease Monks. Maybe because their hands were always slick with oil. Maybe because their work felt a little like prayer, repetitive, patient, and quietly sacred. One mechanic, Private Sam Lewis, once joked, "We fix them by faith and profanity," and it wasn't far from the truth. When you're half-starved, half-frozen, and being shelled from a mile away, precision mechanics turn into improvisation. They heated engine parts over field stoves. They used rifle slings as fan belts. They patched fuel leaks with chewed gum and torn canvas. And somehow, the tanks kept rolling. The army repair. Manual called it deferred maintenance. 18 men called it wishful thinking. They knew every shortcut in the book. How to restart a dead battery with jumper cables made from tent wire. How to align a bent tread by driving backward down a frozen hill. How to fix a broken transmission by smacking it until it worked. Maintenance by momentum, one officer called it. As long as the tank moved forward, nobody asked how. Conditions in Belgium made everything worse. The Ardennes winter was merciless cold enough to freeze engine oil solid by morning. Fuel drums turned to blocks of slush, and when the snow melted, it became endless, sucking mud. Men would joke that the mud could swallow a jeep and burp up the radio antenna, but nobody really laughed. Every time a tank bogged down, it became a sitting target, and when the tank stopped, the line stopped, and when the line stopped, someone somewhere was about to die, so the mechanics kept working, in snow, in smoke, in silence, sometimes fixing engines while shells whistled overhead. One of them later wrote, "We stopped hearing explosions. The wrench drowned them out." Their toolkits were meant for precision socket wrenches, pullers, gauges, but most were lost or broken by winter's third week, so they made their own tools. A crowbar from a track pin, a hammer from a frozen boot heel, a screwdriver carved from shrapnel. Improvisation wasn't optional, it was survival, and yet, amid the chaos, there was beauty in it. The rhythm of bolts turning, the hiss of fuel lines, the glow of a torch cutting through the dark. It was its own kind of symphony, a machine's heartbeat coming back to life. Every so often, the line commander would visit, impatient, pacing behind them.
How long till it runs?
He'd bark, and someone, without looking up, would say, "Depends if the wrench or the tank gives up first." Then they'd all laugh, not because it was funny, but because it kept their hands from shaking. Food was rationed, but coffee was sacred. A tin mug of instant brew sat on every toolbox, usually half filled with more grease than caffeine. They drank it anyway. Sometimes they even poured it on frozen bolts. The warmth helped loosen them. By 3 a.m., they'd be working by lantern light, steam rising from their breath and the tank's engine. If the machine turned over that deep, throaty rumble of power, it felt like resurrection, the kind of sound that made exhaustion worth it. It was said that one mechanic could keep 5 tanks alive, but only if he stayed alive too. And that was never guaranteed. In forward zones, repair crews were often targeted. The enemy knew that killing one mechanic could disable an entire platoon's armor, so they worked quietly, without headlights, under blackout conditions. Every repair was a gamble, every spark a beacon, and yet they kept going. As one veteran later put it, "We didn't fight the war.
We kept it running. By dawn, the Sherman's engine coughed, sputtered, then roared."
The men stepped back, faces lit by fire and frost. They didn't cheer. They just nodded to each other, wiped their hands on rags that hadn't been clean in months, and moved to the next wreck. They knew the rhythm now.
Night was for fixing.
Day was for breaking. That's how war worked. It wasn't glamorous. There were no medals for tightening bolts or sleeping in oil puddles. But ask any tanker what mattered most, and they'd tell you the mechanic who kept their engine running was worth more than a general's speech, because every working tank meant one more chance to come home. One bolt stripped one tank stranded. Tomorrow's battle depended on tonight's wrench. By early 1945, the frontline mechanics of the Allied armies had turned improvisation into an art form, a strange, oil-stained branch of engineering born from desperation. Their workshops weren't clean garages with polished floors and fluorescent lights. They were frozen ditches, bombed-out barns, and muddy pits where rainwater mixed with gasoline. Here, mechanics rebuilt the war machine one stripped bolt at a time, often under conditions that would make any modern technician cry. Most repair crews lived by one rule: if you couldn't fix it properly, fix it creatively. That meant cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles, welding armor plates with makeshift torches powered by car batteries, and rebuilding transmissions using whatever scrap metal hadn't already been blown apart. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and in war, working was good enough. A tank that could move for another 10 miles was one that could save lives, or at least buy time for the next advance. A typical repair might start with the sound of grinding gears echoing down a valley, followed by a Sherman limping into the repair yard, track half off and smoke pouring from its rear. The mechanics would swarm it before the engine cooled, removing side plates and inspecting the damage. One man would crawl beneath with a flashlight. Another would start pulling spare parts from a nearby wreck, a kind of mechanical surgery performed under fire. If a replacement part wasn't available, they made one. Track pins were hammered straight on an anvil made from a shell casing. Bearings were retooled using melted scrap poured into rough molds. It was messy, dangerous, and strangely beautiful in its own way. To weld in the field, crews often linked together 2 truck batteries to create a crude arc current. The sparks looked like fireworks in the dark, but to the men working with their faces inches from molten metal, it was just another night at the office. Gloves were a luxury, so burns were common. Many wrapped their hands in bandages soaked in motor oil, believing it kept the blisters soft. It didn't, but no one had time to argue. The repair line had to move. The official records show that by late 1944, roughly 70% of all damaged Allied tanks were repaired and sent back to battle within days. That statistic is staggering when you consider the conditions: no supply chains, minimal equipment, and constant bombardment. Each successful repair was a tiny act of defiance against entropy itself. The German artillery could blow up a Sherman by noon, and by dusk that same Sherman might be rolling again with a new turret borrowed from another wreck. Teamwork was everything. No mechanic worked alone. One man turned the wrench, another held the light, a third prayed the patch would hold. The bond between them was a quiet, unspoken thing. They rarely saluted, seldom spoke about bravery, and almost never complained.
They just worked.
In the strange rhythm of war, their night shifts became a kind of ritual. The whine of a ratchet replaced the sound of prayer. The hiss of a blowtorch replaced the warmth of home. They coped the only way they could with dark humor. Someone once scrawled on a broken gearbox, "May run forever or 5 minutes." Another painted the words "officially fixed" on a tank that had survived 3 separate rebuilds. A favorite joke went, "We can rebuild anything but morale." It wasn't far from the truth. The mechanics didn't just keep tanks moving, they kept soldiers believing the machines and maybe the war could still hold together. Of course, the ingenuity came at a price.
Accidents were common.
Welding accidents, chemical burns, crushed hands, and occasional explosions turned the repair yard into its own kind of battlefield. There were no medals for losing a finger to a faulty jack stand, and no chaplain read prayers over a burned-out generator. But still, every morning the same men showed up with grease-streaked faces and a new round of jokes, ready to fight rust and gravity one more day. Their officers, often unaware of how much they improvised, simply marveled at the results. When a tank rolled back into combat 24 hours after being declared scrap, it was treated as a miracle. One colonel even wrote in his after-action report, "The mechanical spirits of my division appear to be possessed by divine intervention." In truth, it was less divine and more diesel mixed with blood, coffee, and unfiltered stubbornness. In the Pacific, things weren't much different. On jungle islands like Leyte and Okinawa, mechanics worked knee-deep in mud and rain, fighting rust as much as the enemy. The humidity corroded every bolt within days, so they used kerosene-soaked rags to keep engines alive. Fuel drums doubled as workbenches, and spare parts came from the wreckage of both friendly and enemy vehicles. There were even cases of US crews adapting captured Japanese tank parts when the supply ships couldn't get through. Necessity didn't care about national pride. One diary from a motor pool sergeant in Belgium summed it up perfectly. "We're not fixing machines. We're resurrecting them. Every time one starts again, it feels like cheating death just a little." That sense of purpose kept them going. For many, it wasn't about glory or medals. It was about motion keeping the war machine alive, one weld at a time. The soldiers at the front might never know their names, but they felt their work every time a tank roared to life after being dead the night before. Modern mechanics, working in clean garages with digital diagnostics, might shake their heads at how primitive it all was. But in 1944, there was no luxury of waiting for parts or safety inspections. The war demanded improvisation, and these men delivered. Their unofficial motto could have been, "Safety second,
Results first." It wasn't printed anywhere, but everyone knew it. By night's end,
when the engines finally turned over and the tanks were ready to rejoin their units, the men didn't celebrate. They simply lit cigarettes, leaned against the warm armor, and listened to the low purr of the machines they'd brought back from the dead. There was something hypnotic about that sound, steady, rhythmic, almost peaceful. In the middle of chaos, it was the only proof that their effort meant something. The war might have been fought by soldiers, but it was sustained by mechanics, the men who refused to let metal die. They didn't wear medals, but they wore scars. Their tools were few, their humor dark, and their nights endless. Yet they never stopped working, because they knew that somewhere ahead, another tank would break down, and another crew would be counting on them. The war machine never slept, and neither did its mechanics. In the grand sweep of World War II, historians often speak of generals, battles and strategies of Normandy, Stalingrad, or the Bulge. But behind every tank that rolled every truck that delivered ammunition, and every plane that took off from a muddy airstrip. There stood a quiet army that never appeared in headlines, the Maintenance Corps. These were the men who turned chaos into order, metal into motion, and failure into function. They didn't win medals for heroism under fire, they won the war with wrenches, grease, and sheer endurance. The success of the Allied forces wasn't just measured in firepower or tactics, it was measured in readiness, the ability to keep machines running, supply lines moving, and armies advancing no matter the terrain or the toll. For every Sherman that charged across France, there were mechanics who had spent the previous night rebuilding its engine with salvaged pistons. For every convoy that reached the front lines, there were engineers who had kept those trucks running long after their service life had expired. Without these unseen hands, the war machine would have ground to a halt long before victory was even possible. By 1945, the Allied maintenance system had become one of the most efficient repair networks in history. Mobile workshops, entire convoys of trucks carrying tools, spare parts, and portable forges could set up shop within hours of a battle. They created an unbroken chain of restoration stretching from the front lines to the rear depots. Tanks damaged in combat could be stripped, rebuilt, and returned to service within 48 hours, a logistical miracle that left German field commanders bewildered at how fast Allied armor seemed to come back from the dead. It wasn't just about fixing what broke, it was about improvising better solutions. Field mechanics discovered new welding techniques, reinforced armor points that consistently failed, and re-engineered cooling systems to prevent engine fires. Many of these innovations, born in muddy workshops under shell fire, influenced post-war vehicle design and maintenance protocols. The same field fixes that kept Shermans moving through the Ardennes would later inform the service manuals of peacetime engineering schools. What began as improvisation became innovation. The legacy of these men didn't end with the war. When peace returned, many of the same mechanics who had once rebuilt tanks under fire went on to help rebuild nations. They became factory foremen, engineers, and inventors. The discipline, problem-solving, and resourcefulness forged in the crucible of war shaped post-war industries across America and Europe. Civilian technology, from cars to heavy machinery, benefited from techniques first developed on the battlefield. The post-war boom was powered not only by victory, but by the veterans who knew how to make the impossible work with too little time and too few tools, yet their recognition remained quiet. The maintenance crews rarely appeared in documentaries or victory parades. Their work was too dirty, too routine, too behind the scenes for glory. But within the military, their reputation was legend. Commanders knew that an army marches on its stomach and advances on its engines. Logistics won wars, and maintenance made logistics possible. A tank division without mechanics was just a scrapyard waiting to happen. Among the soldiers, there was a kind of reverence for these men. They might not have carried rifles into the front lines, but every infantryman knew when the tanks didn't start, the guns didn't fire, and the trucks didn't move, victory stalled. The mechanics didn't fight the enemy face to face, but they fought a different kind of war, against time, weather, exhaustion, and mechanical failure. Their battleground was the engine bay. Their enemy, rust and fatigue. One general famously wrote in his field report after the war, "Our success did not ride on the backs of our heroes, it rode on the wheels they kept turning," and that was the truth of it. Every repair done in darkness, every improvised fix that got a tank moving again, was a quiet act of defiance, not against an army, but against defeat itself. It was a kind of unsung heroism that didn't come with medals or ceremonies, yet it powered the entire Allied advance from Normandy to Berlin. Looking back, it's clear that these grease-covered men in their oil-stained uniforms were as essential to victory as the soldiers who held the line. Their ingenuity turned disaster into momentum. Their persistence turned setbacks into solutions. They proved that wars aren't only won by strategy or courage, they're won by those who refuse to let the machine stop. As the final engines of war went silent and peace returned, the legacy of the Maintenance Corps endured not in monuments or parades, but in every machine that runs a little longer because someone refused to give up on it. They taught the world a simple truth. Victory is often built, not won. They didn't drive the tanks, but they made sure someone could. War, for all its noise and fury, often ran on something far humbler than heroism. It ran on coffee. In the mud, in the smoke, in the moments before dawn assaults, coffee wasn't just a drink. It was survival in liquid form. Soldiers swore by it, medics prescribed it, and generals demanded it by the gallon. Somewhere between the chaos of artillery and the quiet before battle, a tin cup of steaming, bitter brew became the heartbeat of an exhausted army. In 1943, on the Italian front, a US infantryman could go days without a warm meal or a full night's sleep. But if he could scrounge enough water and a handful of brown granules from his sea rations, he could still find a reason to keep moving. Each little packet marked Instant Coffee Type 1 was the Army's promise of comfort in a world gone mad. It dissolved fast, tasted terrible, and still felt like magic. Soldiers joked it was coffee by name, courage by necessity. Brewing it, however, was its own battle. Without kitchens or kettles, GIs got creative. Some boiled water in empty ration tins over candle stubs. Others used their helmets, a method that, while efficient, left a faint metallic tang that no amount of sugar could hide. "We didn't care," one veteran later said. "If it was hot and it had caffeine, we called it good." The ritual of making coffee became a small act of rebellion against exhaustion itself, a moment of normalcy when the world refused to be normal. For many, it wasn't just about taste or warmth, it was about connection. Soldiers gathered around makeshift fires, trading jokes, complaints, and sips from dented cups. The steam fogged their glasses, the smell mingled with mud and gun oil, and for a few minutes, they were human again. The laughter was thin, but it mattered. In every platoon, there was always one man who hoarded sugar packets, another who had somehow acquired a real mug, and the rest who envied him like he was royalty. Coffee also became currency. On the front, a good brew could buy you a favor, a cigarette, a dry pair of socks, even a spot closer to the fire. It was the closest thing to luxury most troops would ever see. In field hospitals, nurses joked that the wounded didn't ask for morphine. First, they asked for coffee. "Pain we could handle," one nurse wrote in her journal. "It was the cold that broke us. Coffee was warmth you could hold." The US military soon realized caffeine was more than morale. It was logistics. Studies from 1944 showed that alertness on night shifts increased significantly with regular coffee consumption. So the Quartermaster Corps started prioritizing its shipment. If ammunition ran short, they'd ration carefully. But if coffee ran short, morale plummeted like a downed plane. Soldiers could march on empty stomachs, but not without caffeine. Even Eisenhower reportedly carried his own personal stash of instant coffee packets just in case. In Italy, British and American troops often swapped supplies: tea for biscuits, chocolate for cigarettes, and always coffee for everything else. The British called it muddy Yankee juice, but they drank it anyway when their own tea ran dry. On both sides of the front, caffeine was the great equalizer, the one comfort even an enemy soldier would understand. The recipes, if you could call them that, became part of the folklore. Some added condensed milk from ration tins. Others mixed in cocoa powder to dull the bitterness. A few daring souls stirred in whiskey, claiming it balanced the flavor. Others boiled the same grounds 3 times, insisting the third cup was the lucky one. It wasn't gourmet, it was grit in liquid form. A corporal stationed near Naples once wrote home, "We drink it before battles, after battles, during air raids whenever we can. It tastes like rust and rainwater, but somehow it reminds me of home." That was the power of it. Coffee wasn't just caffeine, it was memory. The scent of mornings long gone, the echo of kitchens thousands of miles away. In every sip, there was a whisper of peace. By the winter of '43, the Army's dependence had become almost comical. Reports circulated of entire battalions refusing to move until the field kitchens fired up the burners. Commanders learned fast: issue the coffee first, the orders second. "Caffeine before courage," one lieutenant joked. And he wasn't wrong. Even today, historians say World War II might have been the most caffeinated conflict in human history. Between the US, British and Canadian armies, over 250 million pounds of coffee were consumed during the war. It powered not only soldiers, but also factory workers, nurses, pilots and codebreakers, anyone trying to stay awake long enough to outlast the darkness. In the end, that's what coffee represented: defiance. A hot cup in a cold world, a moment of warmth in a time of destruction, a bitter taste that somehow reminded you life was still sweet enough to fight for. The sun rose over Italy another day, another brew, another war. Behind every successful operation of World War II, every dawn assault, every midnight convoy, there was a quiet, invisible supply chain devoted not to bullets or bombs, but to beans, coffee beans. The Allied armies didn't just march on courage, they marched on caffeine. Keeping millions of soldiers awake, alert, and functional across continents became one of the strangest logistical challenges of the war, one measured not in gallons of fuel, but in cups of coffee. By 1944, coffee had become as essential to the American war effort as ammunition. The US Army Quartermaster Corps calculated caffeine into its ration system like a weaponized necessity. Their reasoning was brutally practical. A tired soldier was a dead soldier. So, along with food, uniforms and fuel, entire convoys were dedicated to transporting tins of ground and instant coffee across the Atlantic. In total, the United States shipped more than 140,000 tons of coffee to Europe during the war, enough to fill nearly 30,000 trucks. It wasn't a luxury, it was strategic morale control. Every branch had its own caffeine culture. Navy ships ran
on endless pots of black coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in.
Pilots in the Army Air Forces took it as strong as aviation fuel because, in truth, both kept them airborne. On the ground, infantrymen received small packets in their sea rations marked Instant Coffee Type 2, a brown dust that promised wakefulness even when sleep was impossible. It mixed with water, snow, or whatever liquid wasn't shelling related, and it kept soldiers moving when fatigue could have been fatal. But the logistics of keeping everyone caffeinated were absurdly complex. The US had to import massive quantities of coffee beans from Latin America, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica through convoys constantly threatened by German U-boats. The British, meanwhile, faced their own rationing nightmare. Tea shortages in Asia forced them to rely partly on American coffee shipments. By 1943, the British Home Office even approved caffeine tablets for soldiers in lieu of tea, leading to one officer's dry complaint: "The pills keep us awake, but not polite." Military engineers soon developed systems to ensure coffee could be brewed anywhere, anytime. Mobile field kitchens were fitted with coffee boilers capable of producing gallons at a time. Some armored units even installed makeshift brewing, rigs on tanks, a field modification that would horrify modern safety officers. But for exhausted crews, a boiling cup of instant coffee before dawn could mean the difference between alertness and disaster. Commanders quickly recognized coffee's psychological power. The caffeine itself was important, but the ritual, the smell, the warmth, the break from chaos did something deeper. It reset morale. It gave shape to time in a world where hours blurred together. One British psychologist attached to the Mediterranean Command wrote that a single cup of hot coffee at dawn can restore more fighting spirit than a week's rest. He wasn't exaggerating. Field reports from North Africa to Normandy showed a direct link between coffee distribution and combat readiness. In short, sleep was optional, coffee wasn't. There were moments, however, when the supply chain faltered and morale along with it. In the winter of 1944, during the Ardennes offensive, snow and disrupted routes left several US divisions temporarily without rations. Letters from the front told the same story. "We can take the shells, but not the no-coffee mornings." Soldiers began brewing mud coffee from roasted barley, acorns, or anything that vaguely resembled a bean. The results were disastrous both in flavor and spirit. As one corporal put it, "That wasn't coffee, that was despair in a cup." Even the enemy took note. German intelligence reports in 1943 described the unusually high coffee consumption of American troops and concluded somewhat admiringly that their morale appears dependent on caffeine. They weren't wrong. The caffeine habit was so deeply embedded that captured US soldiers were sometimes bribed with coffee during interrogations. The same tactic wouldn't have worked with cigarettes or chocolate, but with coffee, it broke men faster than threats. When the war finally ended, the military's caffeine obsession didn't fade, it spread. Veterans returned home hooked on instant coffee, giving rise to the post-war boom in brands like Nescafe and Maxwell House. Coffee became a national symbol of energy, efficiency, and endurance, the civilian continuation of a wartime ritual. The army had turned a stimulant into a strategy, and the world followed suit. Still, for all its chemistry and supply charts, caffeine in wartime was never just about staying awake. It was about staying human in the dark, damp foxholes of Europe and the endless jungles of the Pacific. A simple hot drink meant civilization hadn't entirely burned away. It was a reminder that comfort could still exist, even if only for a moment, steaming from a battered tin cup held by trembling, calloused hands. But when the beans ran low, morale ran lower. In every war, there are things soldiers remember. Long after the noise has faded, the sound of rain on canvas, the rattle of boots on frozen ground, the smell of oil and gunpowder. But ask veterans of World War II what comforted them most in those endless, uncertain days, and many won't speak of medals or songs. They'll speak of coffee, that simple, steaming cup that made the world feel bearable for one more morning. For soldiers, sailors, and nurses alike, coffee became more than caffeine. It was ritual. It gave shape to chaos. It was something you could control when nothing else obeyed the rules. In the field, a cup of coffee was the first act of the day, a fragile echo of the lives they'd left behind. Stirring granules into water wasn't just about keeping awake, it was about remembering home. One private in Italy wrote to his wife, "I drink mine black now just like you. It helps me pretend we're sharing a morning again." Everywhere, the same routine unfolded over trenches, beside tanks, in the shadow of burned-out villages. Men who had spent the night listening to artillery would light a small fire at dawn, boil whatever water they could find, and wait for that smell to rise. It wasn't good coffee. Often it was barely drinkable, but it was theirs. It was proof that life went on, even in the middle of hell. In the Pacific, naval engineers brewed coffee on engine blocks and steel decks that shook from bombardment. Nurses on hospital ships poured it into tin mugs for patients who could barely lift their heads. Air crews drank it cold, straight from ration tins at 10,000 feet, calling it courage concentrate. Each sip was a promise. You're still alive, still fighting, still part of something that endures. Letters home often mention coffee, almost casually, a small detail in a world of fear. "Tell Dad the instant kind isn't bad," one Marine wrote from Saipan. "Wish I could share a pot with you." In those lines, coffee became shorthand for normalcy, for family, for a morning without alarms or orders. It was the most ordinary thing in an extraordinary time, and that was precisely why it mattered. Psychologists later noted how these rituals, small, repetitive acts like shaving, polishing boots, or making coffee, played a critical role in mental endurance. They provided rhythm to lives stripped of predictability. The cup wasn't just a drink, it was an anchor. As one sergeant put it years later, you didn't just drink coffee, you held it, stared at it, and waited for your hands to stop shaking. By 1945, after years of fighting, soldiers across Europe had learned to measure time not by clocks but by cups. Morning coffee before patrol, evening coffee before watch.
A cup after victory, a cup after loss.
It was constant when nothing else was, and in the rare stillness between battles, when the smoke cleared and silence returned, the act of brewing became almost sacred, a quiet prayer made of heat, patience and steam. When the war ended, the ritual came home with them. Veterans brought back their habits, the strong brews, the tin mugs, the belief that no day could start without that first sip. Coffee shops began appearing on corners across America and Europe, fueled not just by caffeine, but by nostalgia, by the memory of what that warmth once meant. The soldier's tin cup evolved into the commuter's mug, but the meaning stayed the same: endurance, familiarity, humanity, because coffee in the end was never really about taste. It was about survival, physical, emotional, and spiritual. In a world collapsing under the weight of war, a few ounces of hot, bitter liquid became a symbol of order, of connection.
Of life continuing despite everything trying to stop it, even decades later.
Old veterans still spoke of it, that first cup after the battle, that last one before moving out. The smell of it still carried them back to those makeshift camps, the laughter in the cold, the trembling hands around a dented mug. It wasn't the caffeine that stayed with them, it was the memory of being human when humanity was hardest to find. And somewhere between dawn and despair, a warm cup reminded them they were still human.